Good day, everyone. I am Kai Licop, together with my group mates Nika Bakiana, Sarah Rico, Darlene Sanchez, and Paula Valmores. We are Team I Love It When You Call Me Senorita. We are going to discuss the salient provisions of the Philippine Technology Transfer Act of 2009. The Republic Act 10055, otherwise known as Philippine Technology Transfer Act of 2009, is a landmark national legislation of science and technology that governs the generation and commercialization of science outputs, clear ownership of intellectual properties, transparent sharing of benefits, and empowered responsible and accountable stakeholders. Since its passage on March 23, 2010, the Department of Science and Technology and Intellectual Property Office of the Philippines remain at the forefront in forging collaborations among the S&T stakeholders for the institutionalization of RA 10055. On August 18, 2010, DOST Secretary Mario Montejo and IPO Director General Ricardo Blanca Flores signed the implementing rules and regulations that further clarified the provisions of the law. RA 10055 traces its roots in 2005 when then DOST Secretary Estrella Alabastro initiated the crafting of a proposed national legislation on technology transfer. To roll out the initiative, a proposed policy framework was developed, which later became the subject of a nationwide stakeholders consultation and the basis of the technology transfer bill. In the following year, the proposed law saw its filing at the House of Representatives and the Senate as House Bill 3270 and Senate Bill 1721 sponsored by Joseph Emilio Abay and Senator Edgardo Angara respectively. Recognizing its merit and potential grounds of its support from various stakeholders, Congress approved the bill 4 years later. The defeat of RA 10055 would not be possible without the support of various government funding agencies, research development institutes, blind agencies, and private sector stakeholders.
Defeat of RA 10055 would not be possible without the support of the various government funding agencies, the Research and Development Institute, life agencies, and private sector stakeholders. So the collaborators under RA 10055 are the Senate of the Philippines, the House of Representatives, the Department of Trade and Industry, the Intellectual Property Office of the Philippines, and the Department of Science and Technology.
Article 2, Intellectual Property Ownership. Under Section 6, the ownership of IPs and IPRs shall be governed by the following. First, recognizing the fact that RDIs are in a better position to identify the potential for economic utilization of IPs and IPRs with the right skills and management capability, the ownership of IPs and IPRs derived and generated from research funded by the GFA, whether such funding is in whole or in part, shall in general be vested in the RDI that actually performed the research, except in any of the following circumstances. First, when RDI gives its ownership to GFA. So when RDI has entered into a public written agreement assigning its ownership of the IPs or IPRs generated from its research in favor of the GFA. Then, failure of RDI to disclose potential IPRs to GFA. So in case of failure, whereupon the GFA shall assume the rights to the potential IPR. Then, failure of RDI to initiate protection of potential IPRs. So, in case of failure within reasonable time from confidential disclosure to the GFA, which shall in no case exceed 3 months from public disclosure, whereupon the GFA shall assume the rights to the potential IPR. And lastly, in case the RDI ceases to become Filipino corporation, as defined in Article 1, Section 4 of this Act. Then, in case of collaborative research, RDIs shall own the IPRs jointly as otherwise stipulated in the research agreement, provided that the research agreement between RDIs and other funding entities shall be made with the full knowledge of the GFA. Lastly, nothing in the article shall modify IPs that will be owned by employees of the RDIs under IP Code and the existing laws.
The rights and responsibilities are stated in Article 3. So in Article 3, Section 7, states the rights and responsibilities of government funding agency. So under this act, the GFA shall protect government interests in the IPs and IPRs generated from the R&D that it funded in the research funding agreement. The GFA shall monitor efforts and effectiveness of the RDI, and in case they fail to protect, utilize, and commercialize such IP, the GFA provides alternative solutions and assistance. The GFA shall ensure adequate freedom to use the IP for further research to expand the knowledge and requirements for publication of information. The GFA shall allow sharing of revenues from IP commercialization. Also, the GFA shall obtain a report that includes a review and analysis of the proposed transaction, financial statements, industry information, economic condition, and assumption used therein. So in Article 3, Section 8, the rights and responsibilities of the Research and Development Institute. So under this act, the RDIs shall identify, protect, and manage the IPs generated from the R&D funded by the GFA. The RDI shall report annually to the GFA on the progress of IP and or IPR's commercialization efforts and all of agreements entered and licenses granted. The RDIs shall ensure that they have access to the skills and management capability to effectively perform their responsibilities. The RDI shall accord their staff with incentives to sustain efforts in identifying valuable IP and in pursuing IP commercialization. Then the RDI shall inform the GFA of any agreement pertaining to the research funded by the GFA and entered into the RDI with any other entity or person.
For Article 4, there are two sections. The first one, Section 9, covers the responsibilities of RDIs performing R&D with their own budget. Government RDIs performing R&D through annual budget shall submit annual intellectual property management reports to the national government agencies. It shall contain securing protection on IPs that show commercial promise, technology transfer approaches that are pursued, and lastly, progress of ongoing commercialization of technologies derived from R&D funded from their own budget. The second section is Section 10, which covers the responsibilities of the concerned national government agencies. They shall monitor efforts and effectiveness of the annual report of RDIs, such as securing IP protection and pursuing IP commercialization. Article 5, with only one section, Section 11, covers revenue sharing. It is said that unless a revenue sharing provision is stated in the funding agreement, all revenues from the commercialization of IPs and IPRs from R&D funded by GFAs shall go to the RDI. Moreover, RDI share must always be greater than the total share of the GFAs. If R&D is not solely funded by a GFA, the RDI may enter into contractual agreements with the other entity or entities that provided a part in funding. The article adds that sharing of revenues between RDI and their researcher shall be governed by an agreement such as an employer-employee contract without prejudice to the rights of researchers granted under Republic Act 8439.
Commercialization by the researcher and establishment of spin-off firms. Article 6. Section 12. Commercialization by researchers. If the researcher, who is also an employee of an RDI, wants to commercialize his or her IP, the RDI cannot restrict him or her from establishing or accepting employment from a spin-off company which will undertake the commercialization. The employee researcher is also allowed to do this without formally leaving the RDI. The employee researcher may take a leave of absence for a total of 2 years to deal with matters regarding the spin-off company and will still be allowed access to the RDI's facilities. Section 13. Detail or secondment to the private sector. If a researcher of a public RDI will be employed by an existing company, he or she is subject to the provisions of RA 8439, which states provisions regarding his or her benefits like allowances and grants.